This is David Bergantino, author of the Freddy Krueger's Tales of Terror series. You're listening to the 80s Slasher Librarian's audiobook presentation of Twice Burned. Keep it scary out there.
You see in your dream.
When I want you in my arms, when I want you, and all your charms. Whenever I want you, all I have to do is dream, 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 dream. When I feel blue in the night and I need you to hold me tight. Whenever I want you, all I have to do is dream.
Just remember,
I can make you mine, taste your lips of wine, anytime, night or day. The only trouble is, gee whiz, I'm dreaming my life away.
Freddy Krueger's Tales of Terror Twice Burned by David Bergantino. Chapter 19. As Colleen drove away from Kirk's house, Vicky pulled into the driveway at Mrs. Waddell's house. Actually, she had arrived a half hour before, but a police car had been in the driveway, so she had parked down the street and watched. Finally, the front door opened and two police officers exited, got in their car, and drove away. Now, checking herself in the rearview mirror, her new look, but hot all the same, she made her move. The doorbell played a quaint melody when she pressed the button, minutes after the police left. After a few seconds, the door opened. Vicky gave Lance a bright smile. Lance did a double take. "Vicky?" he asked, surprise giving way to suspicion. The face was recognizable, but the rest was not. Instead of her usual spiked hair, Vicky wore it combed out. Cotton replaced leather as the predominant fabric of her clothing. Gone were the studded biker boots. Soft loafers adorned her feet instead. The only remnants of Vicky's former style were the 4 empty holes in each earlobe. Now only one set of earrings dangled there. The overall effect was stunningly different, and not at all unattractive. "Yes, it's me," Vicky responded cheerfully, after giving him ample time to take in all her details. But he still didn't invite her in. "What are you doing here?" Lance's voice hardened a little. He smelled a rat somewhere behind Vicky's delicate perfume. "I borrowed most of this stuff," Vicky admitted in a calculated fashion she hoped wasn't obvious. "I'm trying new things. All this murder business and fighting has gotten me thinking."
Uh-huh.
Lance grunted, folding his arms in front of his chest. Vicky was aware she was going to have to try harder, but not too hard, of course. That would give it away. "I've wanted to make peace with Colleen, but she won't talk to me. Can't say that I blame her, but I'm trying. Or at least I would, but school was out today, you know?"
Yeah.
Beyond the monosyllable, Vicky thought she detected a tremor of belief, so she buckled. "Look, this was stupid. I'm sorry. Bye." Turning abruptly, she marched back down the front walk. For effect, she clenched and unclenched her hands at her sides and made just enough noise so that Lance would think she was arguing with herself. Then she heard it. "Wait!" Lance called from the front door. Vicky turned and saw him standing on the welcome mat. It wasn't running down the walk to stop her, but it would do. "Come on back," he called. After a pause, she walked slowly back up the walk.
What's going on?
He asked. He was smiling good-naturedly. Now the suspicion was merely a tremor. Soon it would be stilled. Vicky took a deep breath. "I just came to ask you to talk to Colleen for me. Tell her I'm sorry. I don't know if being friends is possible, but I'll take what I can get." Then with a nervous laugh she added, "I'm a little short on friends these days." Lance was evidently taken by her request. "Of course, I'll tell her," he said. Then his expression became mildly suspicious again. "You want to come in? I was just making tea for Mrs. Waddell. I mean, I'd offer you a soda or something, but there isn't any." "Oh, I don't think that would be a good idea," Vicky told him. "Mrs. Waddell and I aren't that close, you know." Lance laughed at her apparent self-consciousness.
No offense, but I bet she won't even recognize you like this. But we could stay in the living room if you want.
"Okay, I guess, if you're sure." Sure, I'm sure, he said brightly. Come on in. Soon they were sitting in Mrs. Waddell's painstakingly neat living room having tea. A police car passed me as I drove up. Were they here? She asked casually.
Yeah.
He said. Want to hear something strange? Vicky shrugged. Why not? The other night when they caught Denny here, it was because of a phone tip. A neighbor?
That's what they thought. But the 911 log says that the call came from this house.
There was a woman here that night, right? Yeah, but she didn't make the call, or so she says. And besides... Lance leaned forward, getting into the story. Now here's the weird part. The call came in long before Denny broke into the house. Otherwise, the police would never have made it in time. It's like someone knew that he was going to come here. Maybe the phone log is wrong? Lance leaned back, thinking.
That must be it. But none of the neighbors will admit they called.
He took a sip of his tea. Probably didn't want the hassle. Yeah, that must be it. Of course, Lance agreed.
I mean, how could anyone know where Denny was going to go?
Gravel ricocheted off the underside of the car as Colleen pulled into the parking area. Blue and red neon illuminated the night. Fortunes told. This time Colleen sincerely hoped so. The Indian woman's eyes flared wider than before when Colleen walked into the front room. I need to see Madame Zavira, Colleen told her. With a sniff, the woman stood and went through the beaded curtain. A moment later she parted the beads once more and motioned for Colleen to step through. Madame Zavira sat in her high-backed chair, smiling. She waved Colleen forward, seating her in the chair to her right. The Indian woman left them alone. I've been expecting you, the fortune-teller intoned, creepily. You have? Colleen asked in wonder. Of course, said Madame Zavira. Then her eyes twinkled. I knew you'd be angry when you found out those boys had played a mean trick on you. With me, as well as them, I'm not a mean woman, you know. Oh, that, Colleen said, when she realized what Madame Zavira was talking about. I know you're not a mean woman. I wouldn't be here if I thought you were. Madame Zavira was momentarily perplexed. Then why have you come? The theatricality crept back into her voice. Do you know what's been going on since we were here? The killings? Ricky, the boy who used to come here, he was murdered last night. Madame Zavira bowed her head and nodded slightly. I've been having these feelings. Everyone thinks a friend of mine, Denny, did this. I know he didn't. I don't know how I know, but I do. There's an answer right in front of me, but I can't reach it. I've been having these dreams. She stopped, her thoughts suddenly unfocused. Anyway, despite what happened when we were here, I don't think you're a total fraud. Madame Zavira rose up slightly at the mere suggestion. And even if you were, I still think you might understand some of these things. I feel like I can talk to you. Madame Zavira's face was still as stone. Unreadable. Colleen knew she was going out on a limb, but at this point she felt she had no choice. Lance didn't want to hear it, and she had gotten such a good feeling from Madame Zavira before. Until the very end, of course, but that was theatrics, and looking back, Colleen could tell the genuine moments from the false ones. I owe you one, the fortune-teller said to her, winking. Now give me your hands. Colleen rested her hands in Madame Zavira's. Instantly, the woman's eyebrows went up. I see. You've been having dreams. The dark man I warned you about. Yes, it's Denny, but at the same time, not Denny. More like someone wearing a costume that makes him look that way. Colleen could swear she felt a mild electrical current running between them. Madame Zavira nodded, pleased with Colleen. You have gifts, my child. They are in front of you, but just out of reach for now. When you master them, you will get your answers. What kind of gifts? The thought intrigued Colleen. Powers of premonition, intuition, compassion, the fortune-teller told her, much like the one of your former selves. Former selves? Colleen asked. Past lives. You were Joan of Arc in a past life. burned as a witch because she had visions. I'm doing a report on her for my history class, Colleen said, amazed at the coincidence. Madame Zavira frowned. Maybe I just picked that out of your brain then. She winked slyly at Colleen. Sometimes I read minds like that, but you never know. In any case, I bet your report will be the best in the class. Madame Zavira became serious once more. Unfortunately, I cannot tell you who the Dark Man is. Why not? Colleen asked. She realized that's what she wanted from the psychic, a quick, easy answer. I'm sorry to say that evil pervades this world. This place even more than others, Madame Zavira told her. To point out a particular motive evil here would be the same as trying to locate an individual drop of water in the ocean. Thank you anyway for talking with me, Colleen said as she stood and began to open her purse. Madame Zavira held up a hand. I told you already. I owed you one. Colleen accepted without argument, thanked the fortune-teller once more, and started back through the beaded curtain. But Madame Zavira's voice stopped her before she left. Beware of the Dark Man, child. He is still out there, and you are very close to him. Colleen nodded gravely. There was not a hint of melodrama in the fortune-teller's voice. She was being deadly serious. Chapter 20. During the ride home, Colleen reflected on her encounter with Madame Zavira. Despite the woman's dire warning as she left, Colleen felt much better. At last she had found someone who accepted her feelings as possibilities, and she had said that Colleen had powers that would bring her the answers. Colleen just hoped she would find the answers before someone else died. Rethinking the situation, she still felt certain there was a pattern to all of this. Now that the tarot cards had been eliminated, it must be something else, but what? First, she eliminated Denny, who was obviously outside the pattern. He was older and had been killed by the police. The students' circumstances had been more mysterious. That's when it hit her. They were all students, but not just students at Springwood High. They were all students in Mr. Kluski's history class. Tish in her class, Ricky and Melina in an earlier class. A connection danced in Colleen's mind, then spun away. She was stymied once more. All three had met their ends, or supposed ends in Tish's case, under vastly different circumstances. Another realization struck her. Ricky's death had not been fully explained by the police. Though his body was found in the lake, there had been no mention of drowning. Perhaps he was dead before he was put in the lake. That was the key, she thought, intuition. Somehow Ricky's death was the key to the whole business. But how would she find out? If the police weren't talking to reporters, she could hardly call them up herself, ask, and expect an answer. Ricky's parents might know, but asking them was out of the question, regardless of the stakes. Ricky's parents, Kirk had seen them, he might know. The business with the tarot cards became instantly insignificant as Colleen realized she had to talk to Kirk. Without stopping to phone ahead, she drove straight to his house. Luckily, Kirk himself answered the door. It was getting late, and Colleen hadn't prepared a good explanation about why she had returned. At the sight of her, Kirk gaped. "Can I come in?" she asked when he continued to stare like an idiot. "We need to talk." He hurriedly ushered her to his room. "Look, I promise I won't," he began pathetically. "Don't worry about it," she cut in. "I have to ask you a question. It's not a nice one, but I hope you know the answer." "I don't deserve nice," he said resolutely, "so shoot." "Do you know how Ricky died?" she asked quietly. "Did his parents tell you, or did you hear it while you were there?" "Yeah," he said, shivering slightly. The room was not cold. "This is what they're trying to keep out of the papers. He bled to death." Colleen's eyes widened in horror. She could never have guessed. "I know, and you're not going to believe this, but for history, his report for Kluski was on Vlad Sepesh." "Vlad who?" "Vlad Sepesh, the real Transylvanian count who was the basis for the legend of Dracula." Another chill seemed to run down Kirk's spine. Incredible for a guy who was so into horror and scary stuff to go that way. No, Colleen said, almost inaudibly. That's perfect. She felt faint. What are you talking about? Kirk was alarmed by Colleen's appearance. We need to find out who Tish and Melina chose for their history reports. She began to pace the room for Aunt earlier class. She shook her head. No, that doesn't matter. We can get a list for both his classes at the same time, but how? Can't just walk up to him and ask. He'll want to know why. She stopped when Kirk suddenly stood and grabbed her by the shoulders. What are you talking about? He asked, concern bright in his face. Why do you need a list of report subjects? I have a hunch, but unless I have proof, you'll think I'm crazy, like Lance already thinks. She forced herself to sit down. Look, I don't think you're crazy. If you need to know what reports people are doing, we can find out. How? Kirk sat in front of his computer. Pull up your chair, he ordered. She scooted over as he typed furiously at the keyboard. After a few seconds, she heard the sound of telephone touchtones. There came a click, then a high-pitched whining sound, then nothing. Soon the computer asked for a password, which he typed in. The screen blanked out for a moment and then returned with the greeting, Welcome to the Springwood Library Online. What's that? Colleen asked, feeling a little dumb. Computer literacy was not one of her powers. We're in the library. It's the same system we use to check out books. I'm assessing the database remotely. Colleen would have been impressed if she knew what the point of this was. You want to know about book reports? Well, we all know almost everyone in the class got their books at this library. So let's see what they've got checked out, huh? As his fingers danced on the keyboard, Ricky's name appeared on the screen. Tapping the center button made the screen go blank again. Then a list came up. Kirk pointed to the top lines. See? European myths and legends. From Transylvania to Hollywood. A couple more. All books dealing with Vlad Tepes. He waved his hands at the lines toward the bottom of the screen. And here's his history. If we keep going down, we can find the name of every book he's taken out since the system was put in. Suddenly, he realized he was talking about his friend who had died violently the night before. He suddenly seemed about to drown in melancholy. Colleen pushed her chair closer to his, as much to keep him on track as to look at the screen. Try Tish. What books did she check out? Kirk silently entered Tish's name into the computer. Her list replaced Ricky's on screen. Amelia Earhart, he said dully. Colleen knew she was almost there. Of course. Do you see what I see? Kirk's look clearly said he didn't. Amelia Earhart disappeared. So did Tish. Ricky bled to death. His report was on the guy who was the basis for Dracula. Now that he could see it, Kirk didn't want to believe. That's impossible. Melina, Colleen ordered. Try Melina. After another few seconds, Kirk came back with the name Isadora Duncan. Both had heard the name, but neither knew exactly who she was or how she had died. I got an idea, Kirk said, but I gotta log off first. He did so, and after the computer dialed, it was soon connected to yet another computer system. Almost all the online services have electronic encyclopedia. He clicked his mouse a few times and apparently found what he was looking for. Yeah, here it is. Isadora Duncan, he said as he typed in her name. He sat back as it processed his entry. There were 3 beeps, which meant either the results of his search were on screen or the fries were ready at a fast food place. Isadora Duncan, Kirk repeated, reading from the screen. Considered mother of modern dance, blah, blah, blah. Here it is. Died in 1927 in Paris when her scarf got caught in the workings of an automobile. He and Colleen turned to each other in amazement. She was strangled. Colleen's manic energy returned. That does it. The murderer knows the report subject of his victim. That's insane, Kirk exclaimed. When Colleen gave him a sharp look, he clarified himself. I believe it, believe me, but it's incredible. We need to know 2 things. First off, who has access to this information, and what about the rest of the class? She had begun pacing again. Kirk made no attempt to stop her. He was pretty hyped up himself. I'll log back into the library system, he spoke as he tapped at the keyboard. But the access part is pretty easy. The only people who would know would be Mr. Klusky, since he has the assignment sheet, and us. Library employees. But that makes it harder, Colleen realized. No one has a reason. How much reason do you need? Asked Kirk. Someone's just flat out crazy. Okay, I'm back in. Can you print out lists? Colleen asked. We may need them for evidence. Sure can, Kirk replied. Hey, look! Peter Codwell, the linebacker, is doing a report on Dwight Eisenhower. But after you get past the macho books, he's been taking out trashy romance novels. Definitely gonna need hard copy of that. Although she was happy that Kirk's regular personality had returned, he was getting characteristically sidetracked. Just get lists for anyone in our class and the earlier class if you know anyone. I'd better call Lance, she said suddenly. Without asking, she picked up Kirk's phone. A harsh electronic sound greeted her ear. Hey! Kirk cried. He tapped the keyboard in frustration. It's locked up. We only have the one line. I didn't realize. Well, now I have to restart my computer. The way it works, the phone will be locked up too until I get back into the terminal program. Kirk seemed annoyed with her ignorance. Then she realized that he was bothered about something else. Why do you have to call Lance? He said, betraying the source of his irritation. Because he's not in Klusky's class, which means he may be immune to what's going on. She didn't like what she was going to say, but she knew it was the truth. If something happens to us, she explained, someone else has got to know what's going on. Kirk saw that she was serious and nodded. Why don't you get the list together? I'm going over to Mrs. Waddell's and fill Lance in. Colleen shook her head. He's going to think I'm even crazier than before, but if you're on my side, and we have this proof, maybe... Go see what you can do. I'll take care of things here. Thanks. I'll either call from there or come back later. Colleen gave Kirk a big hug. He didn't dwell on it too long and got back to tapping names into the keyboard. She heard him snicker as she reached the door to his room. What? She asked, unable to resist. Vicky Stratton. Report on Mary Antoinette. He pointed a finger high in the air majestically. Let them eat cake. Colleen smiled and then frowned. Great, print it. Kirk gave her a thumbs up as she left. In her car, Colleen was secretly worried about Kirk. He was having too much fun with this. She suspected that he considered it a big game, and that could be dangerous. At least one mystery was solved. Denny couldn't have been the killer. He could barely read, let alone use the computers or be able to plot a crime as bizarre as this. But that only gave rise to yet another mystery. How did Denny fit into this at all? She would have thought him just a victim of circumstance, but he had admitted to knowing something about the murders, and he was shot attempting to kill Mrs. Waddell. Colleen could sense an answer dangling in front of her face again, but apparently she had still not mastered her powers well enough yet to grasp it. Vicky Stratton stood in Mrs. Waddell's kitchen, rinsing teacups. Normally she abhorred such work, but it was all for a good cause. She was having an immensely enjoyable time with Lance, and, more important, Lance seemed to be enjoying her company. If only Colleen would call, or, better yet, show up unannounced. The shock of seeing her precious Lance with her arch-enemy would no doubt cause a deep rift between the two. But Vicky was patient. If not tonight, there was always the next night, or the next. A loud thump resounded from the bedroom. Lance must have dropped that big book. He's reading the old bat, Vicky thought. As she placed the last teacup in the dish drainer, Vicky heard quiet footsteps behind her. Lance, no doubt. Just for kicks, she pretended not to hear him. She wondered if he was going to kiss her. It wasn't essential to her plan, of course, but it would be a bonus. Knowing he was right behind her, she turned around quickly, smiling. Vicky Stratton was still smiling as the blades of a large pair of gardening shears bit into her neck. Not long after Colleen had left him, Kirk got bored with printing out listings of classmates. Besides, he thought, that would only really help after the fact. What they really needed was to find out who was doing this. So he decided to enter the suspects' names into the computer, Mr. Klusky and the library employees. He even checked on his cousin Lance. It wasn't long before he uncovered a killer. Tearing the listing from his printer, he ran for his car. He had to stop Colleen before something terrible happened. If he hurried, he might catch her. Colleen knew something was wrong the moment she pulled into Mrs. Waddell's driveway. The house was entirely dark. Lance's car was missing. She would have pulled away, but noticed the front door was ajar. Against her better judgment, she left her car and pushed the front door all the way open. With little light from the street, the doorway became a gaping black maw. Reaching inside, she found a light switch. As she pushed it up, the little alcove just inside the house was immediately illuminated. And directly in front of her, resting atop a vase that had once held dried flowers, the severed head of Vicky Stratton stared at her with dead eyes. Chapter 21. Colleen doubled over in terror, a choked scream escaping her throat. Then, her thoughts racing faster than her comprehension, she staggered back to her car. Screeching out of the driveway, Colleen sped down the street. As she drove, it seemed Vicky's head floated just beyond the windshield. There was no way to block it. She finally gained enough control of herself to scream at the top of her lungs. Still, her thoughts made no sense. What had happened to Vicky, and where were Lance and Mrs. Waddell? Colleen had gone no further into the house, but somehow knew it had been empty, at least devoid of anyone living. Lance's car was gone. Had he gone somewhere? Or... A terrifying thought occurred to her, and her greatest fear was not that Lance was dead, but that he was alive, and had been the murderer all along. The police, Colleen forced herself to think. I have to get to the police. Finally, seizing upon a course of action, she got her bearings and started driving toward the station. As she approached the Jaguar Diner, headlights approached from the opposite direction. They swerved from side to side. At first, she thought the driver was drunk. Then, she recognized the car. Kirk didn't care if he was speeding. They needed the police right now, and if it meant him leading them on a chase all the way to Mrs. Waddell's house, so be it. He'd make them understand once they got there. As he neared the business district, he was doing almost 50 miles an hour. The top of his convertible was down and the wind was strong. Luckily, the printouts were in the glove compartment. A popping noise from the steering column interrupted his thoughts. Suddenly, the car became hard to control. The steering became sluggish. The wheels turned left on their own. He jerked the wheel hard to the right, but overcompensated. He was heading for the curb. His foot let up on the gas instinctively, but it was too late. The car was traveling much too fast, and he had no control. Colleen watched helplessly as Kirk's car careened past. It hopped the curb and hit a fire hydrant on the fly. The car rolled several times, finally smashing violently into a telephone pole. There was no explosion, just the sound of water gushing from the broken hydrant. "Kirk!" Colleen screamed and leaped out of her car. She was oblivious to the other cars screeching to a halt as she ran across the street. At Kirk's car, she stopped short. Her friend's face was bloody and bruised. His head seemed set at an unnatural angle to his body. Kirk was dead. Dropping to her knees, Colleen started to sob. This was how James Dean had died, she thought bitterly. In a car accident. I knew what was going on and I wasn't able to stop it in time. "I'm sorry, Kirk," she told him. His eyes stared off into space. If this were a movie, Colleen supposed, she should reach over and close his eyelids. But she couldn't bring herself to do it. Somehow it would be an admission that she had failed, and she would not admit defeat, not yet, because she knew this wasn't over. Right after, she noticed the paper spilling out of the glove compartment. The door had been broken open by the accident. Recognizing them as library database printouts, she ran to the other side of the car to examine them. Sirens blared in the distance, coming nearer. The murmur of a crowd rose around her as others approached the site of the accident. But Colleen didn't hear any of it. She was busy scanning the reading list. One set made her stop cold. It was 2 pages, and almost every book was devoted to violent crimes, serial killers, and similar morbid subjects. Except for one of the more recent books, a complete collection of Grimm's fairy tales, and the name above it, Clarice Waddell. Tossing the papers back into the car, Colleen pushed her way through the gathering crowd and got back into her car. It had been Mrs. Waddell all along. That had been the answer just out of reach. Now she had it. But Mrs. Waddell had Lance, and Colleen thought she knew where. A fire engine, ambulance, and police car arrived as Colleen started her engine. One bystander pointed in Colleen's direction. She had been witnessed as being first on the scene. The authorities would want to talk to her. There's no time for that now, Colleen thought, as she put the car in gear and drove off. As soon as she saw Lance's car in the library parking lot, Colleen suffered another crisis of faith. Her instincts had served her well, but again she didn't know what she expected to accomplish. Even with surprise on her side, was she any match for a savage killer? It seemed absurd. But obviously Mrs. Waddell was not just a helpless old woman. Colleen remembered her tarot card reading. Madame Zavira had said the upside-down queen on the card represented an evil man or woman. Finding herself walking toward the library's front doors, Colleen realized why she had come. This wasn't about beating Mrs. Waddell at all. She had failed everyone else, but she would not fail Lance. And she realized that she really did love him. Regardless of what happened to her, she had to try and save him. Kirk's words came back to her. She would do anything for Lance, even something stupid. As she expected, the library door was unlocked. Bracing herself, she entered. The library was dimly lit, except for a bright spot just beyond the checkout counter. Calling out Lance's name, tentatively, she walked toward the light. Soon she was standing at the top of the basement stairs. Down there, someone had turned on all the lights. Obviously, it was a trap. Obviously, Colleen had to go down there. Taking the steps slowly, Colleen called out once more. As before, she got no reply. Standing at the bottom of the stairs, she looked out into the basement that stretched before her. It was the first time the basement had ever seemed brighter and less foreboding than the rest of the library. She walked toward the back of the basement, keeping close to the wall in case someone was lurking in the recesses of the book stacks. But no one leaped out at her. Just before the open space at the center of the basement, she heard a groan, Lance's voice. Forgetting the danger, she ran forward and discovered him lying on the study table. His hand rubbed a bruise on his temple. "Lance!" she cried and threw herself over him. Frightened, he recoiled and tried to push her away. Colleen stepped back so he could see that it was her. "It's all right. It's just me. What happened?" Slowly, he sat up on the table. The motion made his head ache more, and he brought his hand up again. He spoke haltingly.
"I don't know. I was reading to Miss Waddell. I dropped the book. Someone hit me, I think."
He finally started to notice his surroundings.
"How did I get here?"
"I think Mrs. Waddell brought you in your car,"
Impossible.
he said, trying to shake off his feeling of disorientation.
"She can't even speak, let alone walk or drive a car."
"It doesn't matter," Colleen told him, not wanting to argue. "But we should get out of here." He agreed, and she helped him to his feet. He stood unsteadily for a moment while he regained his balance. Colleen asked, "Was Vicky at the house tonight?" At first, he didn't seem to remember.
"Yeah, she showed up out of the clear blue sky, all made up. Weird. What?"
"She's dead," Colleen told him, and wouldn't say more. Lance didn't ask. Lance was still weak, so he threw his arm around her, and she helped him toward the staircase. As they neared it, they smelled smoke. From the bottom of the stairs, they saw that the main room of the library had become too bright, and with an orange flickering light. Leaving Lance in the basement, Colleen ran up the steps. Before she reached the top, she saw. The library had become an inferno, and between the old wooden shelves and the paper from the books, the fire was spreading quickly. She leaped up the last 2 steps to see if they had an escape path, when a figure suddenly appeared at the top of the steps. "Peek-a-boo!" croaked Mrs. Waddell. Colleen shrank instantly away. She could tell this was not Mrs. Waddell any more than the scarred man from her dreams was Denny. It was her body, but being used by some other force. The thing masquerading as Mrs. Waddell shot out a gnarled hand in an attempt to seize Colleen. Though she missed, Colleen lost her balance and fell backward. She tumbled down the steps, landing at Lance's feet. He immediately was at her side.
Colleen, are you all right?
Her arm hurt, but she didn't have time to give Lance the answer. Mrs. Waddell had begun to descend the steps. "Your turn, my dear," the thing laughed. It didn't even sound like Mrs. Waddell. "Time to die the martyr's death that you picked for yourself." Flame seemed to dog the demon librarian's every step. It trailed after her like a hellish bridal train. Hoisting Colleen to her feet, Lance dragged her away toward the back of the library. Mrs. Waddell started laughing, a terrifying sound that made Colleen feel utter despair. As they were about to lose themselves among the stacks of books, Colleen felt compelled to turn back. Mrs. Waddell was at the bottom of the steps. Lance tried to drag Colleen away, but she wouldn't budge. She was transfixed. When Mrs. Waddell got to the old card file, she lifted the entire cabinet. It burst into flames at her touch. As she smashed it to the floor, ancient file cards billowed out, each carrying a torch of flame. Soon the entire basement would be ablaze.
Come on!
Lance shouted. Between Mrs. Waddell's maniacal laughter and the growing roar of flames, it was becoming hard to hear anything else. He started to push Colleen behind a bookshelf when they heard a great crack. Then a slow succession of explosive noises. The bookcase above them began to shake. Books began to fall from their shelves. Then the entire bookcase began to topple, raining books on their heads. This was a heavy mahogany bookshelf. If they stayed among the stacks, they'd be crushed. Diving back into the main aisle, Lance and Colleen saw that Mrs. Waddell had pushed over the first bookcase, starting a domino effect. And in the meantime, she came even closer. "It's the end of your story, Colleen," the thing taunted. "And you can't help yourself any more than you were able to help the others." "I got it," Lance said as they passed the study table area.
Come on!
Pulling her by her uninjured arm, he dragged her to the very back of the basement, underneath one of the small windows leading outside. He pointed down the aisle. A ladder used to get books on upper shelves leaned against a bookcase.
Grab that!
He ordered. She did as she was told. "You're not gonna make it," chanted Mrs. Waddell. "Not gonna make it. You can't escape your destiny, Colleen. You know that. You've dreamed that." It started laughing again. "Why doesn't she just kill us?" Colleen wondered desperately. The sound of the thing's laughter made her feel utterly helpless. "I'm in no hurry, dear," the thing chortled. "The fire will do my work for me." "Don't listen to her," Lance said. "Now get up that ladder." He pointed up toward the window near the ceiling. "No, you go first," Colleen told him suddenly.
What are you talking about? Get up there! I'll hold her off.
"No, you have to go first." She tried to push him. He wouldn't budge. "Listen, you're stronger than me, and besides, my arm is hurt. If I go first and something happens, I won't be able to pull you up, but you can save both of us." Lance hesitated another minute. "You're right behind me," he said, and started up the ladder. But Colleen could only make it the first step before she had to stop while he wrestled with the window. It was stuck. "Now that's a good martyr," the Mrs. Waddell thing said. "Sacrifice. Face your destiny. Your death will be a memorable one." Lance finally got the window opened and squirmed out. Colleen had no choice but to turn her back on the creature as she scrambled up the ladder. She was halfway through the window when Mrs. Waddell grabbed her by the foot. "She's got me!" Colleen cried. Lance grabbed her underneath her shoulders as Colleen kicked out, but Mrs. Waddell only tightened her grip.
Come now,
the creature hissed.
time to die!
Colleen felt as though she would be torn apart. Mrs. Waddell reached for her other foot, but Colleen drew it back. Then, taking aim, she kicked the woman squarely in the face. Her foot connected solidly. There was a crunching sound, and Mrs. Waddell let go. Falling backward, she managed to take the ladder with her, and Colleen was left dangling in the air. Lance tried to pull her quickly through the window, but his strength was failing. He waited a fraction of a second, and by that time Mrs. Waddell had wrapped her arms around Colleen's waist and was pulling her back down again.
Your precious Lance is getting weak, Colleen.
It spoke to Colleen like an intimate.
I may be able to pull him down with you. Then I'll have you both.
Colleen knew the thing was right. Lance was holding tight, but his strength was no match for the evil Mrs. Waddell. The flames and smoke were all around now. If they got pulled back in, they wouldn't last long, with or without Mrs. Waddell to dispatch them. "Let go of me!" she shouted to Lance. "Get away from here!"
No way,
he shouted back.
I'm not giving up, and you can't give up either. Fight, Colleen. You know how to do that now, remember?
Colleen wanted to argue. She wanted to point out the difference between defending oneself against a bully and fighting a demon like Mrs. Waddell, but she couldn't speak. The pain of nearly being torn apart was too great. Soon the roaring of the flames began to fade. So did reality. Colleen let blackness wash over her.
That's right.
Mrs. Waddell's voice seemed to come from close to her ear, whispering,
Let go. It's over now.
So Colleen let go. The blackness enveloped her completely. But she wasn't alone. Others milled about in the darkness. A sourceless light came up, revealing Tish, Melina, Ricky, and Kirk in a group. Even Denny was with them. They all looked at her with pleading eyes. It was Denny who spoke for them in a clear, deep voice.
Give up on yourself and you give up on all of us.
The light was extinguished an instant later. Colleen smelled smoke once more and felt pain and heard Lance calling her name. Instead of responding to him, she kicked out with all of her might. Both feet connected solidly with Mrs. Waddell's stomach. Her grip loosened slightly, and Colleen kicked out again. This time the librarian fell back. Denny was right, she realized. If I give up, I give up for more than just myself. And Lance was right, too. A bully's a bully. This time, Lance was able to pull her through the window before Mrs. Waddell could recover fully. While the librarian was still doubled over in pain, Colleen shoved with her feet, using the leverage to knock the heavy bookcase onto Mrs. Waddell. She looked up just as it hit her. Lance pulled her onto the lawn of the library. Both of them lay still for a minute, breathing heavily. Smoke billowed from the windows of the library's upper floors. Lights and sirens from an entire fire department company approached. Colleen looked back into the basement. Mrs. Waddell lay pinned by the heavy bookcase. Only her face and right arm were visible. Whatever powers it had, it could not lift the bookcase to escape. And the flames were closing in. The screams rose in pitch. Mrs. Waddell's face became an almost unrecognizable mask of terror. Unable to look away, Colleen watched as Mrs. Waddell's white hair finally caught fire. All at once, her entire body was consumed in an intense blaze, the whole of Mrs. Waddell's burning away in an instant to reveal a form underneath. Still struggling, still screaming, the shape of a man now lay where the old woman had been only moments before. But this wasn't a normal man. His face was a mass of charred flesh, much more terrifying than Denny's. He stank of evil, and Colleen knew instantly that this was the true dark man who had plagued them all. And by the claw of his right hand, the way it slashed the air savagely, she knew the identity of the dark man. Freddy Krueger, legendary child killer of Springwood. The heat in the basement had become so intense, Krueger's steel talons had begun to glow red hot. Flaming books began to fall from the bookcase behind the demon, covering him like a swarm of deadly butterflies. Then the whole bookcase came crashing down on Krueger, becoming his funeral pyre. Colleen finally tore her eyes away. Lance sat beside her silently in shock. And later, explanations to the police and fire officials were not easily made. No body was found in the ruins of the library's basement. Epilogue. Time to write the end for another tale of terror. That girl Colleen may have burned me up, but I still got plenty of recruits for Freddy's summer reading program. It's gonna be a hot one, believe me. And don't feel too bad for my latest batch of victims. They all got what they wanted beyond their wildest dreams. Kirk is now sitting at the wheel of his very own Porsche Spider, the same kind of car his idol James Dean died in. At his side, the wind blowing through her spiked hair, is Vicky. She's more his speed than Colleen was, anyway, don't you think? And in the back seat sits Ricky, bookended by Tish and Melina. Who could ask for more than best friends together for all time? Cruising down the road in a fast car. And they lived happily ever after life, right? Right. Except for the concrete wall Kirk runs into while driving over 150 miles an hour. And just to make sure he gets it right, I let him do it over and over again. Forever, he and his friends had become eternal crash test dummies. Now it's back to my current book, the complete story of Jack the Ripper. It's been a long time since I've read a classic fairy tale with a happy ending. What's surprising is that some people were actually afraid of this Ripper character. Between you and me, I consider him a hack! Okay, Slashaholics, this has been Freddy Krueger's Tales of Terror, Twice Burned by David Bergantino. Before I get into my little breakdown of the conclusion of the book and pretty much the whole book altogether, I want to play a little clip of the unedited part of when I was narrating the part that revealed that Mrs. Waddell was the killer. Check this out here. Tossing the papers back into the car, Colleen pushed her way through the gathering crowd and got back into her car. It had been Mrs. Waddell all along. Ha, knew it. Yeah, so I was a little excited whenever I realized it was her. I was like, I got it right this time. So yeah, you weren't laughing too much, were you, David, while you were listening to my guesses? Anyways, great book, really enjoyed it. It was more of a slow burn, no pun intended, compared to Virtual Terror, but at the same time, I really enjoyed the drama, enjoyed the characters, and enjoyed the whole whodunit and how everything played out. You can go back and listen to my individual chapter uploads. Each one of those in the playlist section, you can hear me discuss all the chapters that I did. I'm pretty much going to be discussing the final 3 chapters here. First off, I want to say thank you again to Jeremy Wilson for voicing most of Lance's role in the book, most of his lines. I had to fill in some here and there, the ones he missed, but that's okay. Thank you, Jeremy, and your friend PMDG for helping you edit your lines and get them to me to make my job easier placing them in the audiobook. Thank you, David, for writing this book and letting me narrate it. It's been a blast. Wow, those last 3 chapters were a marathon. It's like had to catch my breath when I was done. So yeah, let's talk about Twice Burned. So straight out of the gates, when we got introduced to Colleen and Kirk, I think we all knew somebody like Kirk at some point in our lives. Pretty much seems like a good friend, good goofy friend, but you never expect them to really be a winner or have the girl or whatever. You kind of underestimate them. Sure, Kirk later in the book kind of did some questionable things because he was in love with Colleen, couldn't take no for an answer. But you know what? Sometimes nice guys don't need to finish last, and I was a little bummed out that Kirk didn't survive the story, but he did do a couple fucked up things, especially with the death card and lying to her face. But yeah, when we met the characters, Colleen was likable, but I don't know, there's just something about the way she was thinking about Kirk. You know, it's like, oh, come on, you're not that shallow, are you? Which we found out later, maybe not so much. The mean girls, they were definitely a lot of fun. Vicky, Melina, and Tish. Like someone asked, I think Mac888 asked, how did they ever become friends? And I think your guess was right, Mr. Mackey. That, you know, Vicky one day said, "You two bitches are my friends." That's the way I see it, and that's the way it went down. I gotta say, the last book, Virtual Terror, I really enjoyed like the roller coaster ride of the whole thing. A lot of action throughout the whole book. The deaths, you know, spaced out in the book. And going into this book, after the first couple chapters, I thought it was going to go the same way. It was, like I said, it was much more of a slow burn. But the ride getting there, and once we got to like the last 4 or 5 chapters, and things really started to pick up, people started getting knocked off. The deaths were very, very gruesome for a young adult novel. I really enjoyed the whole twist that everybody that died the way that their history reports person died in real life. That was a really cool twist, David. Thanks for that. That was a very intriguing way of going at it. And the reveal, I gotta say, I'm happy that I was right, that it was Mrs. Waddell, but I think the whole stroke scene that she had kind of gave it away to me a little bit, or at least really made me suspicious of her, maybe a little too much, but hey, I got it right this time. And even though that scene did make it seem like she was definitely the killer, there were still things that happened after that, and in the same chapter as that had me second guessing myself. So I can't say it was too easy to predict, because there were times where I was thinking, okay, it's Ricky. You know, I never thought it was Denny, because I thought that was a little too on the nose. I enjoyed the whole Joan of Arc of the story. I enjoyed her having the nightmares where she's getting burned at the stake by Freddy that looks like Denny, kind of, or whatever. I enjoyed the scene that she had with Freddy, you know, where he's like the torchbearer like Denny, but still Freddy, you know. That was a really cool scene with all of her friends in that little corral, you know, miniature, and the death card catches them on fire. I love the Madame Zavira of the story. That was a lot of fun, getting to play this, just hamming it up as a fortune teller. And the reveal was great. The whole scene with Kirk rushing to find her, losing control of the car, and the final battle in the library. I gotta say, when the place started going up in flames, I was like, how the hell are any of them going to get out? I thought everybody was going to die. So it was a really intense scene, really put me in there, really put me in the moment. Great writing for a young adult novel. Great writing in general for a horror slasher book in general. You know, I know that David wasn't allowed to use Freddy very much, but he made great use of Freddy even when Miss Waddell hadn't revealed to be Freddy yet when she was doing the voice, the book even said her voice wasn't hers. And, it was gravelly or whatever, like Freddy's. Great stuff, really creepy. I could just picture this sweet-looking old librarian talking like Freddy, setting it on fire, trying to kill Lance and Colleen. It was a really hardcore ending. It was exciting, it was suspenseful, and it was terrifying. For a young adult novel, I gotta say, it really exceeded my expectations. Virtual Terror might have been more fast-paced, and this one might have been more slow-paced, but they both did a great job at what they set out to do. I gotta say, David did a great job on this book, and I'm looking forward to reading Help Wanted. I love the way that Freddy went out in this book, being pinned down and burning to death again. And I always love, the Crypt Keeper-esque stuff with him in the prologue and epilogue of these books. And, So, this has been Twice Burned, folks. I look forward to the podcast about a print slashers where we talk about it. David's going to share some stories, he said. A lot of this book came from his real-life experiences, so I can't wait to hear what that's all about. And I'll be back very soon, where we're going to be starting up Freddy Krueger's Tales of Terror, Help Wanted, by David Bergantino. It's the last book in the series written by him that I've done on the channel. I've already done Deadly Disguise and Virtual Terror. Help Wanted's the last one by David. A little later on, I'm going to do the first 2 books in the series that were written by Bruce Richards. They're not connected story-wise with David's books. It is cool how David's books kind of mention the book before each time. I did enjoy that aspect too. Great connections. Until next time, this has been your friendly neighborhood 80s slasher librarian saying, thanks for listening. Be excellent to each other. Pleasant dreams! And we'll see you next time.
When Master Evil comes to play and Mother says that it's okay, Alex and Josh are stowed away.